You're listening to the Seattle Neighborhood Crier.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Cindy Barker. I'm going to be your host today on the Seattle Neighborhood Crier. We're going to do another show on emergency preparedness. And today we've got a real specialty area to talk about. And we may not realize how important it is, but by the end of the show, I'm pretty sure that you're going to thank these folks who do this volunteer activity for us. Our guest today to talk about this is John Newstrom. He is a volunteer with the Auxiliary Communication Service, and we're going to call it ACS through most of the show because Auxiliary Communication Service is really a mouthful. They are the volunteer branch of the Office of Emergency Management, and their primary mission is the ham radio communications network. And there's a saying nowadays that says, it's not your grandfather's radio. They have made amazing advances in technology, and so we've gone long past the Morse code, and we're also going past voice into the digital uses of the radio waves. But John's going to take us through what ACS is, how he got involved. We'll hear a little bit about his background and the missions of the Auxiliary Communication Service. We've got a couple of, for those of you who are watching on video, we're going to have a couple of aids to look at as he talks to certain points of his coverage. If you're listening on the podcast, don't forget that you can always go to our website and look at them in the show notes if you want to follow up afterwards. So I'd like to introduce John Nordstrom. I know John Nordstrom. This is terrible. John Newstrom. He's going to describe first, give us a little background about who you are. How did you get involved? How did you come to this ACS mission?
Well, Cindy, thank you. And I don't even look close to John Nordstrom, but I wouldn't mind filling his shoes someday. But anyway, I've been interested in emergency preparedness for a long time. In 1979, I lived in an island in Alaska called in a town called Petersburg, and I helped them write the disaster plan for Petersburg. And that was kind of my introduction into the formality of things. But I've been a ham radio operator for a long time, since I was a teenager, and also I have lived abroad a lot doing media development projects. So I built radio stations on 4 continents now, and I got interested in the Seattle ACS when I got to move to Seattle from Kenya, and decided that I needed to get active in ham radio again. And the next thing you know, I found this organization, and I thought it was really, really cool. I also volunteer as a Red Cross volunteer, and I teach disaster preparedness.
Great. So you've got a background that you bring, and so the next thing I'd want you to cover is the Auxiliary Communication Service, ACS itself. What is it that it does? What's its general mission? And you might even start that with what's ham radio's history and how does that come into this?
Okay, well, I think ham radio is a good place to start. It's got an interesting history. I won't bore everybody to death. Somewhere around 1900, people started playing around with the electromagnetic spectrum. That's the last time I'll use a big word like that. And they discovered that radio was pretty doggone useful. But the people that were doing it were basically experimenters. They were trying this and trying that. And they eventually discovered radio was a pretty cool thing. So in 1901, there was the first transatlantic communication. And since then it took off. And of course we all know some of the stories about radio. You know, anybody seen the movie Titanic knows how important the radio operator was. And there's today about 250,000 hams, or 750,000 hams, and they're pretty much scattered all around the country. Then there's also a lot of hams around the world. So it's a fairly fascinating hobby. And by the way, when you said it's not your grandfather's radio, here's my radio. This is the extent of my ham radio equipment, this little walkie-talkie. This one cost about $120, but you can buy a ham radio from Amazon for about $30. And so they're not expensive, and it's easy to get into. There's a test. You have to be licensed by the FCC, and there are dire consequences if you try to operate without a license. So be very careful about that. And so that's the reason why ham radio is important to the ACS, the Auxiliary Communication Service, is because you have to be a ham to be a member of ACS. The only other requirement to be a member is to get a clearance from the Seattle Police Department. You go down and get your fingerprints taken, and they make sure that you're not a criminal. But anyway, so that's the ACS, and in terms of that's how you get into it. and how it all works. And what you had said earlier, that we're an integral part of the Emergency Operations Center in Seattle, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a room downtown downtown Seattle, and it's filled with desks and people with computer screens, and most of the time it sits there empty until there is a reason for it to be operating. So anyway, we've got a slide of the mission statement and an overview of ACS that might be useful now, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. So basically, what the overview is, we do emergency communications. Got about 150 volunteers, and it's sponsored by the Office of Emergency Management, which is part of the Seattle Police Department. The team members are licensed amateur radio operators, which is the formal name for ham radio. And we're registered as state emergency workers, and ACS started in 1993. So the mission is pretty simple. It's to provide support to the city of Seattle in times of disaster and emergency, as well as to assist with planned events and exercises. The functions are fairly straightforward. I'm not going to read all these things to you, but they're there. And you can also look at our website, which is www.seattleacs.com. And basically, we do what the city needs us to do. So every time the Emergency Operations Center opens in Seattle, for whatever reason, the ACS is involved. They have a room that's kind of off in one corner, but we're integrally involved with it. And the only reason why we're stuck in a corner is because the radios make a lot of noise, and we don't want to disturb everybody all the time. But we do more than talk on the radio. We also help out with other things. There's another slide that shows the organization graphic, which will come up shortly, I hope. And then we are there for supporting the city of Seattle and what they do. So if we can scan down this a little bit, there we go. There's the general membership. There's a leadership team in the middle. And then we fit into the kind of standard incident command system, which we can, I guess I should just mention briefly. Incident command system is how emergency managers manage things. So the elements of it are planning, operations, and logistics. And so we fit into those and can help out in anything. So if I went to the Emergency Operations Center and was activated, asked to come, in other words, then I could be a radio operator. I could be sitting at a computer at the planning section and working on situational awareness, trying to know and find out what's going on. Or, you know, maybe it's just stand by and wait until we need you and we'll ask you to do something. It could also be as simple as, oh, it's lunchtime, we need somebody to go get 50 sandwiches for everybody in the room. We're happy to do whatever it is. And there's our website. And like I said, it's seattleacs.com, and it'll tell you a lot. You can poke around in there, and there's also contact information there. So we also go ahead.
Well, one of the things I want to go back and cover is when you talked about that you activate. In the series that we've been doing here, we talk about the different times different groups activate. So, for example, the hubs activate really in a big disaster, all communications down. We know that's when ACS is going to be down there too, but I wanted to help people understand that it isn't just you activate not just in the big disaster. You activate because you can always help. There's always a need for communication. Radio will always get through when everything else is down, but give us an example. I know you guys activated during the big Seahawks parade, which was really interesting because you would never think that you would need radio services. So I think there's some stories that came out of that too, right?
Absolutely. And that was one of the examples I think really shows the importance of it. The Emergency Operations Center activates anytime there's a complex situation. It doesn't have to be an emergency. And an event like that, there were hundreds of thousands of people at that parade in downtown Seattle, and it started to involve more people than just the police or fire department or any one department of the city. So that's when the Emergency Operations Center comes in. And when the Emergency Operations Center comes in, we come in. So it turned out that there was so many people downtown, people were texting, they were videoing the parade, they were sending stuff by the cell phones. And next thing you know, the cell phones failed. The cell phone towers were totally overwhelmed. text messages seemed to get through, but video didn't. So there's a hint for you for the emergencies. Use text, don't call, and don't send video, and don't send pictures, because it ties up the cell phone network. And so what happened was, the result was the police were spending a good chunk of their time communicating, passing messages around, and that's not their job. It really isn't. Now, we weren't providing on-the-street support. We weren't asked to. But it turned out that the event planners also had a radio system of their own that they were going to use, but it also failed for a technological reason. So it was unfortunate that that communication problem came up. But we also activated when the NFL opener happened, and I was working on that one. And so I was the roving person, so I was outside walking around and just letting the operations center know, and particularly the Seattle Department of Transportation, is traffic moving? Are the pedestrians blocking streets so cars can't get through? How long does it take cars to get through an intersection? Did the school buses make it? Are the ferries running? You know, on the ground eyeballs, so to speak. And that was the first time Seattle ACS was asked to do that. It was a lot of fun, by the way. I hope I answered your question.
Well, I have the other part of it, and people might have snorted when you said we'll go get sandwiches if you need to, but all volunteers know your skills can vary, and you'll be called on to do stuff. The way I heard the story was, you know, everybody had been in the EOC like 6 hours, and so it was like, go get sandwiches, and a couple of the ACS guys went. They ordered from somebody who was on the other side of the parade route from ACS. So these people are with hand carts, and they're trying to bring back all these sandwiches, and they were given status reports as they were going, because they were trying to make sure they knew how deep were the crowds, what streets were passable on the periphery of the, you know. So what turned out to be maybe we should order not on the other side of the disaster area, or, you know, the crowd area, but it turned out to be they still assisted. They were still able to give status as they were progressing. So, you know, the flexibility, we always talk about flexibility in an emergency situation. Prime example of how ACS is really trained to take advantage of the situations where they can contribute. So let's go back and talk ACS. You know, talk about the organization itself and how it operates, because the one point of pride to me for ACS is it is so well organized. They're licensed emergency, you know, registered emergency workers. They are very structured, because in an emergency, in this particular, you know, and it's, you know, technology is not a simple just walk in and do it. You have a lot of structure that needs to happen. And so talk about the organization itself and how you guys train, you know, build on your mission there.
Sure. Basically, it's like any other organization. You've got a leadership team. Mark Shepard, whose name is on the front of the website as a contact information, is the manager of the ACS, and he does a great job, but it's also a group of people that work together collaboratively a lot. We're 100% volunteers. Absolutely no one is paid at ACS, so it's a volunteer organization. The city has a really well-equipped radio room, but we also bring our own radios with us. And we are trained and taught to come prepared. So if I go to the Emergency Operations Center for even something simple, I will bring my Go kit with me, which you learn about in disaster preparedness, being prepared by having a Go kit. And my Go kit is got 3 days of food in it, and also a place where I can sleep. I can bring a sleeping bag or whatever. Who knows? I may have to curl up on the floor at the Emergency Operations Center, so I bring my bag with me. And I also have my radios with me so that I can go outside and help. In terms of organization, it's, you know, at one look, it's very disorganized, because we're all basically working together trying to solve the problems of the day. Whatever comes up, we'll figure it out. But there are people who are much better at certain technologies than others. There are people that are basically beginners and trying to learn, so we do a lot of training. Once a month we have a formal training session. We do it at the South Seattle College, formerly South Seattle Community College, and we do it on a Saturday morning. And last time we did a training on some technical things, just how to use certain bits of equipment, and then we got into how to do damage assessments. You know, how do you go somewhere and find, you know, look with your eyes and find out, you know, what's damaged, and there's kind of a system for doing that. So we learned how to do that. Other times we've learned technological things such as digital communications using your ham radio. I can take my little walkie-talkie I showed you and get digital messages on it. My web browser opens up and types out something that somebody else had typed in and sent it over the ham radio.
Yep.
And the reason why that's important, folks, is because if there's a big disaster, we're not going to have the telephones. The cell phones may not be working. I'll give you a good example of that. Is in 1962 in the Great Alaska Earthquake. I wasn't there then, but I lived in Kodiak Island in 1980, and people were still telling stories about the 1962 earthquake. The entire island, I'm exaggerating a bit, sank. I mean, there were parts of the land that actually sank 10 feet. So the Coast Guard had a big communication station there that was inoperable. Nothing could get out from the Coast Guard. The telephone company, especially the long-distance telephone company, had the same problem. Their lines were cut. Their satellite dishes, which they were experimenting with, sank, basically, so they couldn't see the satellite anymore. The only communications off the island was ham radio. There was actually one ham that brought his station wagon to the police department. They put the car up on blocks so you could keep the engine running without having to drive, and then people lined up for blocks to send messages home to their friends and family saying, we're safe, we're okay. And he did that for days.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of things that you want ham radio operators doing. There you go.
On the screen, we've got the Wikipedia 1964 Alaska earthquake. It is fascinating reading. I mean, I encourage everybody who has an interest in emergency preparedness to actually look back at some of these, because they give us ideas for how to respond in the future. It's lessons learned is always really critical. I want to build on what you talked about with the training before we leave that. Your organization actually has a very structured training, so when people come new and they want to plug in for the first time, there is a list of training that they're expected and led through, and it encompasses everything. One of the key things is if you're asked to respond to a location, whether it's a local hub, in another neighborhood that you've got to drive to, or downtown, you have to know how to drive in winter weather. So one of the classes that's very interesting is driving winter weather hazards. You know, so it's a very self-sufficient building skill set that people come away with, but also structured so you're not left guessing what is it you need. Talk a little bit about the technologies too. Go ahead. You were going to say something, and then cover some of the technologies and the training and the tech committee work too.
Well, just the quick thing I was adding about the training, and it's not something like it's just a checkbox. You can just check things off. It has to be a little bit more formal than that. So, for example, your winter driving course. I asked if I could just use my Minnesota birth certificate to call that my winter driving course, and they said no. But my first aid class, which was a requirement, I just went to the Red Cross and took the first aid class and got a certificate, and that counted. So anyway, that was my bit on training. The technology, it is ham radio and ACS it's kind of so broad. There's so much technology out there. So some people are really excited by some things, other people are not. So you don't have to be into the technology, but you do need to know how to use your radio. And sometimes that can be a little complicated. Some of the radios, you know, like your cell phone, they've got buttons everywhere, and there's things to do this and do that. So you've got to really learn your radio for sure. That's a minimum. But beyond that, there's some people that are fascinated by other things. I had a friend when I was in high school. He liked to take his little radio the size of mine, and he had a gigantic antenna, and he pointed at the moon and bounced signals off the moon. That was what he was into. There are people today that like APRS, which is a direction finding system. So this friend of mine, a fellow ham, has APS locator on his car. He's got one on his walkie-talkie so that when he's walking around, anybody can tell where he is and where he's been. He's also got other portable ones that he can use if he's called out by ACS or whatever. So if you're covering for ham radio, if you're covering a bicycle race, which we do, and also swims and other competitive events where communications would be important, somebody can have a computer and keep track of where all the hams are and relocate people to where they're more needed or whatever, completely by digital and completely off the air.
Yep.
So fairly easy kinds of things. Other people are into television. There's all kinds of other technology. There's also shortwave radio, which can communicate around the world. So that's not a small bot. Well, they can be. They make small ones if you want to go up. And to give you an example of both training and the depth of the technology, once a year there's this thing called Field Day. So this last June, we went out to an empty lot at the South Seattle College, and we set up 3 complete radio stations in this field. We set up our antennas, we set up generators, we set up a tent so we could stay out of the rain. We had a trailer that the city provided, which is good because then they get to try out their equipment too and try out their facilities in the field. And we went on the air for a 48-hour period and had people there all night, literally talking on the radio, trying to make as many contacts as possible. So there's some that think that that's a contest, that you try to contact as many people as possible. And it is a contest. But it's really showing you're prepared for an emergency. You can, with absolutely nothing but a bare piece of land, set up a bunch of ham radio equipment and make it work. I can give another example of why that's important. There was a cruise ship called the Princeton that sank in the Gulf of Alaska, and there were 800 geriatric passengers on board. It was, and it caught fire and sank. So the Coast Guard went out with the Air Force and everybody else, rescued 100% of them, and brought them to Sitka, Alaska. So here's all these people from this cruise ship in a new town. So the hams got together, contacted those people, and allowed them to send messages home to say, we're safe, and here's where we are, here's where we can be contacted. This is before cell phones, of course.
Right.
So there wasn't an infrastructure problem. There wasn't a disaster that took down communications, but it was just difficult for people to communicate. So the hams jumped in and made these messages.
I think a key thing about that is hams being able to jump in and do that. You touched on it when you talked about Field Day. There is book learning, and then there is the practice. So just to kind of reemphasize, the book learning, ACS and the West Seattle Amateur Radio Club, they help sponsor classes. So people who need to learn to take their test to get their license, there's lots of support in the Seattle area to do that. So you get your license and then you're ready to go. And how do you plug in? Field Day is kind of like the peak level. That's where you're talking about, let's be in the field for a whole weekend operating off our own power. But you guys also give people opportunities to exercise in non-emergency situations. You run the radio controls for the Seattle Marathon and the ride around Mount Rainier, where it's really important to have people stationed so that if a rider or a runner goes down, somebody's near enough to be able to call in medical for it. So that's a very easy way to engage. You get into those parade situations and you just are learning to use your microphone and getting comfortable with running the radio. Then we talk about a little bit about some of the disaster-oriented exercises. For example, the drill that we just did. We've talked about the Lahar situation from the hub's perspective. Talk about what that looked like from the ACS perspective.
Well, it was an interesting event. The scenario, these exercises tend to have a scenario. The scenario was Mount Rainier blew up. And they used a historical event, I don't remember the year, where Mount Rainier did blow up many, many, many years ago. And the Lahar from Mount Rainier went all the way to Harbor Island. And that right now, of course, anybody that's driven by Harbor Island, of Seattle to West Seattle or West Seattle to Seattle, you see these gigantic fuel tanks. Now imagine this hot volcanic fluid moving over the Harbor Island. Well, of course, in our scenario, those tanks caught on fire and spilled. And where did they spill? They spilled into Elliott Bay. And now Elliott Bay is on fire. And then everywhere that Elliott Bay touches catches on fire. So it was a big scenario. And the hubs were activated at the same time during this exercise. So we spent the morning trying out our communications. And I was in the EOC and was the radio control for a certain section of the city and keeping in track with two different hub locations. Actually, I was talking to what's the regional groups called? I mean, the hubs contact their coordinators, and then they would contact the EOC. And I forgot what their term was, but so anyway, that was interesting. We learned a lot during that exercise. We learned that just talking over the radio was tedious and long. We learned that, very simple messages like, oh, this community, these are all, fake messages, so this didn't really happen. I'm just talking about a drill. But we would get a message basically saying this community center has no power and their generator is failing because of the volcanic ash. So it took quite a bit of time to write down what the person was saying about this and getting it into the EOC. On the other hand, we also realized with a disaster this big, nobody can do anything about that generator at that community center for quite a while. So maybe we were wasting our time taking that message, and we should focus on the gas station 2 blocks away that blew up and it's on fire. And that may be a higher priority emergency to take our time. We also discovered that digital is your friend because we found out that if we could pass those messages in half the time, or less than half the time, a quarter of the time, digitally, and not only that, and this sounds really stupid, but we're in the computer age. So you get the digital information on your computer, you can cut and paste it into the computer system that the Emergency Operations Center uses, so that it's just a cut and paste job. Where if you're taking a voice message, you've got to write everything down by hand, probably, although you could type it, I suppose, and then you have to type it into the system. So it was much easier to do digital. We learned a lot, and we learned what worked and what didn't work. And that was very, very helpful. I learned a lot.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of doing those. And one of the outcomes of that was that, if we can move to the digital mode, right, for every place where there is a emergency communication hub, and sector net control is the phrase you were looking for all those places where we're collecting amounts of information and we're trying to figure out what's the priority traffic that has to go through into the EOC, if we can have people in the field with their computers. And that leads us to everybody who's listening out there. I want you to help us figure out how to keep stuff going in the event of a big power out disaster. I mean, I've got some solar panels that I'm ready to bring down to a hub that can help, but those laptops take a lot of power. We've had people suggest, I've talked about this before, I got an exercise bike and I've figured out how to hook it up to a battery, and all we need is a couple of scouts on that bike and we can power stuff. So the inventiveness that comes along with this to get us to using the new technology tools, but I'm going to also go back and say you got to practice doing those voice messages, because if you've just gotten to computer and you've forgotten that skill, so you always build on the skill set that, is always down at the pencil and paper level, the low technology set, and work your way up. One thing that we haven't gotten to in ACS yet, and I know it's a new topic of technical discussion, I just want to put it out there for the people who are going, paper and pencil, how boring, but computer, I'm getting there. There's a thing called mesh networks. Are you familiar with those? Can you talk about that a little bit for the...
Well, not too much, unfortunately. I have basically, oh gosh, how to explain this? The internet is a good way of doing it, because the internet, when you send a message on the internet, you don't even know this happens. But your computer goes to a server somewhere, and the server says, hey, anybody know where so-and-so is? And somebody says, yeah, I do, and then the message goes there. So your message can be routed in amazing ways. So that's what a mesh network is. Everybody is kind of linked to everybody else, and a message can be easily passed from one station to another station to another station flawlessly and seamlessly with no interruptions at all or any actual effort by any of the intermediate people. It's just happening. So that's kind of cool. I haven't actually played with it too much. There's also some groups around here. I mean, ham is wonderful. We're experimenting all the time. There are people that are using frequencies and bands on the radio that are just way up there, really high microwave kind of stuff. And because of the mountains around here, we can use microwave well. So anyway, they're setting up kind of an internet that's not on the internet. if that makes any sense, where you can use these uh, microwave radios to do this stuff. Anyway, it's really incredible technology, but it's hard to get into and
Yeah.
keep it simple.
There's something called APRS. What's that?
That's the direction finding stuff.
Okay, direction.
I don't remember exactly what the initials stand for off the top of my head, but that's the direction finding. So you can go. Your radio sends out a beacon, and it says, "Here's where I am. Here's where I am. Here's where I am." And it's not just ham radio. It's kind of fun. If you go to some websites, you can find where the ferries are. You can find where other vehicles are. Some businesses use APRS to keep track of where their technicians are. Oh, the plumber will be there in 5 minutes. You know, that kind of thing. So APRS is kind of using GPS and radio together so that you can track where things are.
Excellent. Yeah, it's just amazing. One place where folks, if they're interested in this and they're not sure whether they want to commit to ACS or not, we have a thing here in the Seattle area called the Communications Academy. And that is an annual event, and that I'm going to let you describe it more, but for folks, it is here in South Seattle Community College. We tend to use that a lot for the ACS training, and it is a 2-day extravaganza of learning. So why don't you describe that for folks?
Yeah, as I'm looking at my notes, trying to remember what the date is. I think it's in April this year. And
April 11th and 12th.
Perfect. I was going to say the 12th and 13th, so I'm glad you got it right. The 11th and 12th of April at South Seattle College, and it's 2 days of multi-level training. So if you're a beginner, there's a track for you. If you're advanced, you're on a different track. If you are an emergency responder, you know, a first responder going, then it's about communications for you and how you can use it. And it's a really very, very interesting. 2 things I learned last year that I'll never forget. One was we had some group of hams from Alberta, and some of them were emergency management types, and they showed up and said, hey, we had this gigantic river flood, and one of our problems was that, you know, the entire town was flooded, and there are emergency responders, our firemen, our policemen, our emergency communicators were so busy trying to save their homes that they couldn't respond to anybody else. So it took a long time for them to get organized and then also to respond to the system. The other one was somebody told us about being a volunteer ham for the Boston Marathon when the bomb went off. And the big lesson I learned there, he was with the head of the marathon. You know, he's following around the director of the marathon and providing radio communications if needed. And he was in a first aid tent. They were just making a visit at the finish line. When the bomb went off, he was 25 feet away from it. Then something interesting happened. They were told to leave the first aid tent. They wanted only medical people inside. So he left. And then he got a call over the radio saying all the ham radio operators were released. You can go home now. Wow. That was a takeaway message for me, which is that you could do these things, but don't necessarily expect you're going to be active and be, you know, the Lone Ranger coming in to help everybody all the time. There are some times you're going to just, you know, you're not needed anymore. So your job is to say with a big smile, well, I was glad I could help, and then you go home. I had a similar experience when I volunteered for OSO. I went up, ACS was asked to assist in Everett at the Emergency Operations Center. So I went up there for 3 shifts and covered for them. I went Easter weekend, in fact, Saturday and Sunday of Easter weekend, and sat in the radio room. Now, we were told, believe it or not, don't talk on the radio. We were told just monitor the radio, log anything that sounds important, and stand by for anything that comes up. If something comes up and it's an emergency or whatever, of course you can talk on the radio. But right now, just keep your mouth shut and write the stuff down. Now that sounds boring, and it sounds unimportant. You mean I drove all the way up from Seattle to Everett to sit here and do nothing? And that's not true. What we did was, those guys had been working for so long, and here we gave them the Easter weekend off. They could go home to be with their families. They had been working solid for weeks. It was great to be there. The other thing I liked about it was we were showing again that hams are resilient, we're able to help, and we can do this. So I hope that the county and the city learn to rely on ham radio, because we can do this stuff. And I would go back and do the same thing again. It was just fine with me. In fact, I sat there in my spare time. I learned how to use FL Digi, the digital radio stuff. Yeah. So that's how I got my FL Digi working, was when I was working on the OSO mudslide.
Yeah, I know. I am sure that at this upcoming academy, to go back to that, because there's a couple intersections with OSO, there'll be the lessons learned from OSO. It's always a fascinating variety of topics, 2 full days of these types of sessions. And I wasn't at the last session, and what I heard was, I believe OSO happened during Com Academy. Yeah. They were in the middle of a presentation, and every beeper and pager and audio alarm went off, and it was everybody from Skagit County got up and left. Everybody from Snohomish County got up and left. And everybody else stayed in place because they knew next was, the call out. Like you said, it may not have been immediately for Seattle, but where we did plug in, it was really, really, really important. And I think that's a good transition to really talk to people about, what do you get out of this? Why would you join this? What is it that comes to you from doing this?
Well, like when I was in the Boy Scouts, I was trained to be a tornado spotter. And shortly thereafter, I was out driving in a rural part of the Midwest, and I spotted a tornado. Well, there was no phone booth, but I had my ham radio. So I called in the tornado, and the way I did that was, again, just a very simple car radio, and I called it in to a ham that had a telephone. And then he called it in to the civil defense people, and the next thing you know, about 3 minutes later, the warning sirens went off. I was hooked. It was that simple. It was just really important. And communications is always important. There's so many things that you've got to know about. Like one example is if someone's having a heart attack or a stroke, everyone in Seattle knows those minutes count. So you call 911. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's communication. And that person's life could be saved just because you made a 911 call. So that's why the communications is important to do that. And we've heard about, communications failures in different ways that can happen. Well, ham radio, for the most part, works. And we can, if it doesn't work, we'll figure out how to make it work.
Yep. And the service to community is always the focus. One thing I don't think we've talked about yet is if people are interested in joining ACS, what is their time commitment?
Well, it's actually fairly simple. The absolute minimum, I think, is to check into a radio network once a month. Every Monday at 7 o'clock on one of the frequencies, ACS holds a network, and basically it takes about a half hour, and you just call in and say, hey, I'm here. And then you also listen for any news or any changes that are happening in an announcement section. So those meetings, yes, they're the Monday nights at 7 o'clock, and it's just very simple. In fact, I call in, and it takes me less than 20 seconds to check in, but I tend to listen for the whole thing. Then, it's great if you can do more, but start with that and go and build from there. There is an orientation you take. It's about an hour. It tends to happen down at the Seattle EOC, the Emergency Operations Center. And there's other training you can take. And so the rest of the training is up to you. Out of 150 people, I've only met maybe 30. But it seems to be a different 30. Different people show up at different things. So the commitment's up to you.
Right. I don't remember. Is there a certain number of training classes that they want you to? Is it want or you need to do? I cannot remember.
There's you get what they call a task book, and there's like 4 levels, which no one really pays attention to. But there's like I just passed through my. Well, I don't mind saying they don't pay attention to it, but
you're not graded by it,
You don't have a badge that says you are this or that, and you don't have to salute anyone who's a higher rank than you are. But I just passed the associate radio one, so the very first step, and that wasn't difficult. It was check into the nets, do some fairly simple things, learn a little bit about ICS, the Incident Command System, and then the next bit I had to get first aid classes, and I have things checked off in my logbook for the very advanced top level stuff, but I don't have it complete. And then the rest of the steps I've also done some in every one of them. So it's a kind of at your own pace. There's kind of a target of like maybe a year to get at least to some of the levels. But it's not a requirement. You're not going to get kicked out because you haven't shown up for any training or you haven't advanced your logbook.
Right. I think that's the important point. Your own pace and your own skill level comfort. Some people just take a little bit before they volunteer for their first parade or volunteer for their first exercise. And the good thing is there's enough opportunities all year long where if you can't attend something you wanted to, there'll be something coming up the next month. There was an important point that when you and I were talking before this about when you're in ACS, you do kind of go up the scale of checking first that if there's a disaster, you need to know that you're okay, that you've got your go bag, that you're ready to go. Then there is your family. That really is key to ACS, because if you're good and you can leave your family, then you can do service to your community. It's not drop everything and run. You got to make sure our communities can hold together while you're off doing your community service. Right,
and I also think that it's important to know that we're there to help our neighbors too, in a way. So even, like we were talking about activation. The way that we hear of activation is we get a text message on our phone, we hear it on the radio, on the ham radio, we also get an email message. But so it's possible that somebody could be activated and asked to work on something, and they could be home, and they could be online, hooked to the Emergency Operations Center and using their radio to do things. It could also be that you're not called today. And then what your job is to, again, assist your family. That's important no matter what, you and your family and your situation. But then your neighborhood. Check on your neighbors, do all those things. Maybe go to the local hub or, whatever you are interested or able to do to help out. Because, I'm sure you've talked about this and other things. If the really big disaster happens, it might be days or weeks. It was really shocking to me once to hear that, well, we don't have time to pay attention to a broken leg right now. So that we just, don't worry about it. Well, who's going to take care of that broken leg? And the answer is your friends and family and your neighbors. It's just the way it is. There just are not enough police officers and fire people to be everywhere in Seattle at once. You just can't do it. So it could be a while. And it's kind of sobering, but it's the truth. So we all have to help each other.
Yeah, that's a really good thought to kind of come to an end here. I'll ask you for some final thoughts while you're getting ready to think about that. I do want to say we've been showing the website, and I just want to say the address out loud. And I don't remember if we did that at the beginning. So if you want to learn more about ACS, you can go to www.seattleacs.com, and you'll be able to see some of the screens that we've been doing. Boy, I'm hoping that's .com, not .org. Yep, there we go. It is .com.
Yes.
And take a look around. So what would you want to say to everybody? You had a really good statement at the end about being prepared and knowing it's going to be on us. What else would you want to close with, John?
Ham radio is important because it works, and it's been around for 100 years. 100 years. It's probably the first social media. For Twitter was not around 100 years ago. Ham radio was a way of using technology to contact your friends. The technology before that was writing a letter. So between writing a letter and Twitter was ham radio. So there's that, and get your ham license. It's not hard. There are classes all around the Puget Sound area, and it's not difficult. There's training classes to take. You can take the test. It's done here. It's done by volunteer examiners. You don't have to go to some office to take the test anymore, and you don't have to know Morse code.
Yes, yeah. Thank heavens. I really appreciate you joining us today. This was a great show. For those listening today, you can go to our website, Seattle Crier, and click on the show notes to see the visuals that John was referring to, and the topics that we've covered, seattleneighborhoodcrier.org. And I really appreciate it, John. Thank you. This was a great show.
You're welcome, and I'm glad to help anytime.
Okay. I think we're done for the day.